when a biker punched an elderly black woman, knocking her out because he believed people like her didn't belong in the cafe. He had no idea who her son was. Her son, an off-duty Navy SEAL, watched in shock as his unconscious mother fell to the ground. What happened next, and how the SEAL responded, was something no one could have predicted. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from today, and if you enjoy these stories, don't forget to subscribe. Explore the stories. Margaret Benson adjusted her scarf as she stepped out of the cab, her fingers tightening slightly around the strap of her purse. She took a deep breath, inhaling the crisp autumn air of Oakwood, a small town she once knew so well. The sun hung low in the afternoon sky, casting golden hues over the streets, but despite the warmth of the season, an unexpected chill ran down her spine. She turned her gaze towards the establishment before her, Beacon Cafe. Or at least, what was left of the place she once cherished. Her memories of this cafe were full of warmth, afternoons grading papers with fellow teachers, Sunday brunches with her late husband, and the laughter of her 3 sons echoing off the wooden floors. Now, however, the exterior looked different. The quaint red brick charm was overshadowed by large black banners with skulls, leather-clad patrons lounging outside, and the deep rumble of motorcycles parked in a neat row along the curb. She hesitated for a moment, uncertainty settling in her chest. She hadn't been back in years, not since the cafe changed hands. But today was not about nostalgia, it was about seeing her son, Henry. It had been far too long, and she would endure anything for this moment. Margaret pulled her phone from her purse, the screen lighting up with a message from Henry. "Almost there, Mom. Can't wait to see you." She smiled to herself, her thumb hovering over the response button. Before she could type, a large figure brushed past her shoulder, knocking her off balance. Her phone nearly slipped from her hand as she stumbled back. "Watch it, Grandma," a gruff voice sneered. Margaret turned, startled, to see a man towering over her. His leather jacket was adorned with patches of a motorcycle club, his arms crossed over his chest as he sized her up with a smirk. I'm sorry," she said politely, gathering herself. The man chuckled, shaking his head. "You lost or something? This ain't exactly your kind of place." Margaret straightened, refusing to let the sting of his words show. She had endured far worse in her life. "I'm just here to meet my son." His sneer deepened. "That so? He one of us?" "No," she said simply, adjusting her purse strap. "Now, if you'll excuse me." The man let out a low chuckle but stepped aside, muttering something under his breath as she walked past him and into the cafe. The moment she stepped inside, she was hit with the stark contrast to what she once remembered. Gone were the soft jazz tunes and the scent of fresh-baked pastries. Instead, rock music blared from an old jukebox in the corner, and the air was thick with the scent of motor oil and beer. The walls were lined with black and white photographs of men in leather jackets, posing beside their motorcycles, trophies from what she assumed were bike rallies displayed proudly on wooden shelves. Margaret took a slow, measured breath, her fingers gripping her purse tighter. She moved further into the cafe, her low heels clicking softly against the floor. The conversations around her barely paused, but she could feel eyes on her. Some were merely curious, others less welcoming. She spotted a booth by the window, the very spot where she and her late husband, Richard, used to sit every Sunday morning. The thought sent a pang through her chest, but she quickly pushed it aside. She had come here for Henry, not for memories. Margaret settled into the seat, smoothing her cardigan as she glanced around. A waitress approached, her blonde hair teased high and her uniform consisting of a short black skirt and a cropped leather vest with the cafe's logo on the back. The look of mild annoyance on her face was unmistakable. "Can I help you?" the waitress asked, her voice flat. Margaret offered her a polite smile. "I'd like to see a menu, please." The waitress rolled her eyes. "We don't do paper menus anymore. QR codes only." She gestured towards the small laminated sign on the table with a black and white barcode printed on it. Margaret frowned slightly. "I'm afraid I don't know how to use those." The waitress let out an exaggerated sigh, snatching Margaret's phone off the table before she could react. "Here, let me do it for you." Margaret's heart raced at the sudden action, but she remained composed, watching as the young woman tapped the screen impatiently before shoving the phone back at her. "There. The menu's on your screen." Margaret took the phone carefully, squinting at the small text. "Do you still serve those orange marmalade muffins?" "They were my husband's favorite." The waitress snorted. "Lady, we've never had anything like that." "Oh, but you did," Margaret said gently, a tinge of hope in her voice. "Years ago." "Well, we don't now," the waitress snapped. "Bikers aren't exactly into fancy muffins." Margaret nodded, setting her phone down. "In that case, just a black coffee, please." "Fine." The waitress scribbled on a notepad before turning sharply on her heel. "Next time, have your eyes checked, Grandma," she tossed over her shoulder before disappearing behind the counter. Margaret felt the heat rise to her face, but she refused to let the words linger. She had faced disrespect before. This was nothing new. She folded her hands in her lap, breathing deeply to steady herself. She was here for Henry. That was all that mattered. She turned her gaze to the window, watching the world move outside as she waited. The street was familiar yet foreign, much like the cafe itself. It had been so many years since she had last seen her son in person. He had been deployed overseas, dedicating his life to service, much like his father before him. The thought warmed her heart, despite the uneasy environment surrounding her. Henry was a good man, and today, she would finally see him again. Lost in her thoughts, she barely noticed the shadow that loomed over her booth until a voice broke through the air. Well. Still here?" Margaret glanced up to see Jake standing beside her table, his smirk still plastered across his face. "Told you, lady, this ain't your kind of place." She met his gaze, unwavering. "I'm not here for the place. I'm here for my son." Jake scoffed, leaning down just slightly. "And what if we don't want your kind around?" Margaret's fingers tightened slightly on the edge of the table, but she refused to look away. "Then that's your problem, not mine." Jake's smirk twitched, his eyes narrowing just a fraction. But before he could say another word, the bell above the cafe door chimed. A new presence entered the room. A tall, broad-shouldered man in a crisp white navy uniform. His posture radiated authority, his eyes scanning the room before locking onto her. "Henry." And in that moment, as the tension in the cafe thickened, Margaret felt the first true sense of relief she had felt since stepping inside. Henry Benson stepped into the cafe, his polished black shoes clicking softly against the worn tile floor. He took one step forward, then another, letting his eyes adjust to the dim lighting. The air inside smelled of stale beer and fried food, a stark contrast to the fresh autumn breeze he had left behind just moments ago. His presence did not go unnoticed. The moment he crossed the threshold, conversations quieted, laughter dulled, and heads turned in his direction. He wasn't just any man walking into Beacon Cafe, he was a man in uniform. His crisp white navy service dress stood in direct contrast to the dark, rugged leather that dominated the room. His polished brass buttons caught the flickering neon light from the old beer sign above the bar, a stark reminder that he did not belong here. Henry was used to this reaction. He had walked into countless unfamiliar environments in his years of service, foreign cities, war zones, and places where his presence was unwelcome. But none of those moments compared to this one, where hostility didn't come from an enemy force but from his own people, on his own soil. He didn't flinch. Instead, his gaze swept across the cafe, methodically assessing his surroundings. The heavy wooden bar stretched along the right side of the room, lined with bottles that looked as if they hadn't been dusted in years. A jukebox sat in the corner, humming softly as it played an old rock song. The tables were filled with men clad in leather jackets, patches sewn onto their backs indicating their affiliation with some local motorcycle club. And then his eyes landed on her. His mother sat in a booth by the window, her back straight, her hands neatly folded on the table in front of her. She looked small compared to the broad, heavy-set men that occupied the room, but there was no fear in her face. There was something else, something Henry knew well, resilience. He started toward her. "Hey, sailor." A voice cut through the thick air, halting his steps. Henry turned his head slightly, his expression remaining unreadable. Two men had risen from their seats near the bar, their broad shoulders squared, their gazes locked onto him with unspoken challenge. One of them stepped forward. He was tall, built like a linebacker, with a thick beard and arms covered in tattoos. A large leather vest stretched over his chest, the patch on his back reading Iron Serpent's MC. "Didn't know the Navy had a recruitment office around here," the man said, smirking. "Or did you get lost on your way back to the ship?" The second man let out a chuckle, his arms crossed over his chest. He was slightly shorter but no less intimidating, his shaved head gleaming under the dim light. Henry didn't react. He had spent years training his body and mind to remain calm under pressure, to never show weakness, to never take the bait. He simply met the man's gaze and said, "I'm here to see my mother." Silence. Then, the first man, the one with the beard, let out a low chuckle. "Your mother?" He turned slightly, glancing over his shoulder at Margaret before looking back at Henry. "That her over there?" Henry didn't answer. He didn't have to. The man exhaled, shaking his head. "Hate to break it to you, soldier, but this ain't exactly a family-friendly place." Henry's jaw clenched, but he kept his voice measured. "Then maybe you should reconsider your business model." The second man let out a bark of laughter. "You got guts, I'll give you that." Henry didn't respond. Instead, he took a step to the side, making it clear that he intended to walk past them. But the bearded man didn't move. Instead, he angled his body just enough to make his stance unmistakable. Henry's hands remained at his sides, his posture controlled, but his eyes hardened slightly. He could feel the tension in the air, the weight of the biker's gazes pressing down on him, waiting to see if he would push back. A few feet away, Margaret shifted in her seat. She had been watching the exchange with quiet observation, her gaze steady. Henry made a decision. Without another word, he stepped around the man, brushing past him without so much as a glance. The bearded biker stiffened, clearly not used to being dismissed so easily. Henry didn't care. His focus was singular. He reached his mother's booth and slid into the seat across from her. Margaret studied him for a moment before offering him a soft, knowing smile. "You always did have a way of walking into trouble, Henry." He exhaled, shaking his head slightly. "I wasn't the one looking for it." Margaret tilted her head slightly, her eyes twinkling with something almost amused. "And yet, somehow, it always finds you." Henry let out a low chuckle, some of the tension melting from his shoulders. "Maybe." Margaret reached across the table, placing a gentle hand over his. "It's good to see you, sweetheart." Henry looked at her, taking in the familiar lines of her face, the warmth in her eyes despite the cold reception she had received. "It's good to see you too, Mom." But even as they settled into conversation, Henry could feel the stares from across the room. This wasn't over. Not yet. Margaret felt a growing unease settle in her chest. Though she and Henry had managed to carve out a moment of peace at their table, the weight of hostile stares pressing in from across the room was impossible to ignore. The bikers weren't done with them yet. She could sense it, the simmering resentment, the unspoken challenge hanging in the air like a storm waiting to break. She took a slow sip of her now lukewarm coffee, feigning calm. "Sweetheart," she said softly, "I think I need to freshen up before we continue catching up." Henry nodded, his gaze flickering around the room as if he were taking note of every potential threat. "Do you want me to walk you there?" Margaret smiled at him, appreciating his concern. "I'm not helpless, Henry. I'll be just fine." She patted his hand reassuringly before pushing herself up from the booth. As she walked toward the restroom, she kept her pace steady, her chin lifted. She would not let these men see any hesitation in her step. But the moment she passed the group of bikers, she heard the scrape of chairs against the floor. The hair on the back of her neck stood up. She kept walking. Just as she reached for the restroom door, a thick hand landed on her shoulder. "Well now," came Jake's voice, low and mocking, "where do you think you're going, lady?" Margaret turned slowly, keeping her face composed. She found herself looking up at Jake, his smug expression inches from her own. Beside him, Troy stood with arms crossed, his lip curled in amusement. "I'm going to the restroom, if you must know," she said evenly. Jake tilted his head. "You sure you're in the right place? Maybe you meant to go to one of those nice little cafes in the fancy part of town. This ain't exactly your scene." Margaret held his gaze. "I'm well aware of where I am." Troy let out a chuckle. "Feisty. You'd think someone your age would know better than to mouth off." Margaret had had enough. She straightened, her eyes flashing. "And you'd think men your age would know better than to try and intimidate an old woman. What exactly do you gain from this? Does it make you feel strong? Powerful?" Her voice was calm but edged with steel. Jake's expression darkened. The laughter in his eyes disappeared, replaced with something colder. "You've got a smart mouth," he muttered. "That's gonna get you in trouble." Margaret lifted her chin. "I've been through enough in my life not to be afraid of men like you." For a moment, no one moved. The air between them grew thick with tension. Then Jake's smirk returned, but this time, there was no amusement behind it. Just pure malice. "You're gonna regret that," he said. Before Margaret could react, Jake's hand shot out, shoving her hard against the restroom door. Pain exploded through her shoulder as she stumbled back, hitting the wood with force. The impact knocked the breath from her lungs. And then it happened. With no hesitation, Jake reared back his fist and struck her across the face. The force of the blow sent Margaret collapsing onto the floor. The cold tile met her cheek as a sharp, metallic taste flooded her mouth. She felt a warm trickle of blood sliding down from her nose, her vision spinning. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear laughter. The world tilted around her. She tried to push herself up, but her body wasn't responding fast enough. She blinked, willing herself to focus. Then she heard it. "Mom?" The voice cut through the haze. Heavy footsteps. The scrape of a chair being shoved back. A sharp intake of breath. And then, chaos. Henry was a blur of motion. 1 second, he was across the room. The next, he was launching himself at Jake with the force of a man who had been trained to end fights before they could begin. Jake barely had time to react before Henry's fist connected with his jaw. The crack of bone against bone echoed through the cafe as Jake staggered back, his head snapping to the side. Troy lunged forward, but Henry was faster. He spun, elbowing Troy square in the ribs before driving his knee into the man's stomach. Troy doubled over with a grunt, gasping for air. The other bikers shot up from their seats, ready to jump in. Margaret, still dazed on the floor, tried to call out to stop this before it spiraled out of control, but the words wouldn't come. The next moments were a blur of movement. Jake recovered quickly, shaking off the initial blow and coming at Henry with full force. He swung, aiming for Henry's ribs, but Henry sidestepped, his training taking over. He grabbed Jake's arm, twisting it sharply, and sent the man crashing into a table. Dishes shattered. The cafe erupted in shouts. Henry turned, his body coiled with tension, his fists clenched. Troy came at him again. This time, Henry let him. He stepped into the attack, grabbing Troy by the collar of his jacket, and slammed him into the wall. The impact knocked the air out of him, his head snapping back. Then, the sound of sirens. The room froze. For a moment, everything was still except for the ragged breathing of the men involved. The front door burst open, and 2 uniformed police officers stormed inside, hands on their holsters. "Everybody down," one of them barked. Henry didn't move. He stood in the center of the chaos, his chest rising and falling with steady breaths. His hands were still clenched at his sides, his knuckles bloodied. But his eyes were locked on his mother. Margaret had managed to pull herself into a sitting position, her back against the wall. Her face was bruised, her lips split. But she was watching him. And she was afraid. Not of the bikers. Of what had just happened. One of the officers took in the scene, the overturned tables, the shattered glass, the men groaning in pain, and his gaze landed on Henry. Then, his expression shifted. "You," he said, pointing directly at Henry. "Hands behind your back." Margaret's stomach dropped. "No, wait." The officer didn't listen. He moved forward, reaching for his cuffs. Jake, still clutching his jaw, let out a raspy laugh. "You got here just in time, officer," he said. "This guy went crazy, attacked us out of nowhere." Henry said nothing. Margaret tried to push herself up, but her legs felt weak. "That's not true," she said desperately. "They attacked me, he was protecting me." The officers weren't listening. One of them grabbed Henry's arm, twisting it behind his back. The sharp click of handcuffs filled the air. Margaret felt helpless as she watched her son be forced toward the door. This wasn't right. This wasn't justice. As Henry was led outside, he turned his head slightly, locking eyes with her. "Mom," he said softly. Margaret pressed a hand to her chest, struggling to breathe through the weight of everything that had just happened. She had spent her whole life teaching her children that good people did the right thing. That standing up for what was right mattered. And yet here they were. Henry had done the right thing. And he was being punished for it. As she watched the police push him into the patrol car, she swallowed the lump in her throat. The red and blue flashes from the police car lights flickered across the cafe's walls, casting long, shifting shadows. The once loud establishment had fallen into a tense silence, the only sounds coming from the distant wail of sirens and the crackling of the police radio. Margaret, still on the ground, felt an ache radiating from her ribs as she pushed herself into a sitting position. The metallic taste of blood lingered in her mouth, her split lip still stinging from the blow. But none of that mattered. Her eyes were locked on Henry, who stood with his hands cuffed behind his back, his face unreadable. His crisp white navy uniform, once pristine, was now stained with the aftermath of the scuffle, smudges of dirt, blood speckled across his sleeve. And yet, he held his head high, his posture unwavering despite the rough grip of the officer at his shoulder. "This man assaulted us." Jake's voice rang through the cafe, hoarse but triumphant. He clutched his jaw as he addressed the officers, wincing in exaggerated pain. "He came in here swinging, completely unprovoked." Margaret's breath caught in her throat. "That's a lie," she cried, pushing herself onto shaky legs. "They attacked me. He was defending me." One of the officers, a stocky man with a weathered face, barely spared her a glance. "Ma'am, we'll get your statement in a minute." She took a step forward, desperation lacing her voice. "No, you don't understand. He didn't start this. They were harassing me the moment I walked in. He only acted when they hurt me." "Officer," Jake interrupted smoothly, ignoring Margaret's words, "you need to get that woman checked out. She took a fall, hit her head real hard. Probably confused." Margaret's hands clenched into fists. "I am not confused," she snapped, her voice shaking with fury. "I know exactly what happened here." But the officers weren't listening. The lead cop turned toward Henry, his gaze scrutinizing. "Sir, have you been drinking?" Henry's jaw tensed. "I had one beer." "That's it." The cop gestured toward his partner. "Get the breathalyzer." Margaret felt a sickening dread coil in her stomach. She knew how this looked. Henry was a black man in a room full of white bikers, dressed in a uniform that, to some, would mean nothing. He was outnumbered. The truth didn't matter here, perception did. The younger officer, barely out of his 20s, retrieved the breathalyzer and held it out. "Blow." Henry complied without argument. The machine beeped, and the officer checked the reading before nodding at his partner. "It's low." "Well within legal limits." Margaret exhaled a shaky breath of relief. But Jake wasn't done. "Look, officer," he said, shaking his head like he was the victim in all this, "I get it, you got a Navy guy here, all respectable and everything. But this dude lost it. Ask anyone here, he went ballistic, started throwing punches before we even had a chance to talk. That is not what happened." Margaret shouted. The officer ignored her, turning toward the other patrons. "Anyone here see what happened?" A long, tense silence filled the cafe. Margaret scanned the faces around her. The waitress, the same one who had treated her with disdain earlier, stood behind the counter, arms crossed, lips pressed together. The cafe owner looked at his feet, as if hoping not to be noticed. No one spoke. Fear. It was fear. Margaret could see it in their faces. None of them wanted to cross the bikers. Not here. Not when they knew the kind of people Jake and his crew were. The lead officer sighed, looking back at Henry. "Sir, I'm gonna have to take you in for questioning." Margaret lurched forward. "No. You can't do this. You're arresting the wrong person." Henry met her gaze, his dark eyes filled with something quiet, something that made Margaret's heart ache, acceptance. "Mom," he said gently, shaking his head just slightly, telling her not to fight. But she wouldn't accept it. "This isn't justice," she said, voice breaking. "You can't do this." One of the bikers let out a low chuckle. "Looks like Soldier Boy ain't so tough now." Something inside Margaret snapped. She turned sharply toward the patrons, toward the cafe owner, toward the waitress. "You all saw it," she said, her voice trembling with anger. "You know what happened. You know he didn't start this. Why won't you say anything?" The cafe owner shifted uncomfortably but didn't speak. The waitress looked away. Margaret let out a bitter laugh, the sound hollow. "Cowards," she whispered. "Every last one of you." The officers started leading Henry toward the door. Margaret rushed forward, reaching out for him. "Henry." "I'll be okay, Mom," he said, his voice calm, steady. "I promise." She wasn't sure if she believed him. Just as they reached the exit, the cafe door swung open once more. A tall, broad-shouldered man stepped inside, his uniform crisp, his badge glinting under the dim lights. The room shifted. Margaret didn't recognize him at first, but Henry's expression flickered with the briefest flash of recognition. The officer's gaze swept the room before landing on Henry. His brows furrowed. "Lieutenant Benson?" Margaret's breath hitched. "He knows him." Henry straightened despite his restrained hands. "Captain Barrington." "Captain." Margaret's heart pounded as the new officer turned toward the two cops holding Henry. "Why the hell is he in cuffs?" The lead officer hesitated. "Sir, we were told." "I don't give a damn what you were told," Barrington snapped. "Do you have evidence that Lieutenant Benson was the aggressor?" The officer shifted uncomfortably. "We have multiple witness statements saying he." Barrington turned his gaze toward Margaret. "Ma'am, is that your son?" Margaret swallowed thickly. "Yes." "And he didn't do anything wrong?" Barrington nodded once before stepping past the officers, stopping in front of Henry. He studied him for a long moment before turning back toward the lead cop. "Uncuff him." The officer hesitated. "Sir." "That's an order." Reluctantly, the officer reached for his keys, unlocking the handcuffs with an audible click. Henry rolled his shoulders slightly, but his face remained unreadable. "Thank you, sir." Barrington turned toward the bikers, his gaze sharp. "Now," he said, his voice carrying through the room, "I think it's time we got to the real truth of what happened here." Margaret felt something shift. For the first time that night, she felt hope. Captain Barrington let the silence stretch for a long, heavy moment. His piercing gaze swept across the cafe, taking in the uneasy expressions, the shifting feet, and the lingering hostility on the faces of the bikers. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting a cold glow over the scene. Margaret stood frozen near the door, her heart hammering in her chest. Her eyes flickered from Barrington to Henry, now free from the cuffs but still rigid, his jaw tight with controlled frustration. The weight of the moment was suffocating. "All right," Barrington said finally, his voice calm but laced with authority. "I want statements from every single person in this cafe. And I mean everyone. No one is leaving until we get to the bottom of this." A murmur rippled through the room. Jake, still nursing his bruised jaw, scoffed and leaned back against the bar. "What's there to sort out? You've got a room full of witnesses. They'll tell you what happened." His voice carried that same smugness, that same confidence that the people here would back him up. Barrington turned toward him slowly, his expression unreadable. "Is that right?" Jake smirked. "Yeah. Ask anyone." The captain exhaled, then turned toward the cafe owner, who stood behind the counter, his face pale. "Mr. Reynolds," Barrington said, his voice firm but not unkind. "You saw what happened. What's the truth?" The owner hesitated, his fingers gripping the edge of the counter. His eyes darted toward Jake, toward the other bikers who were still seated, watching, waiting. Margaret could see the conflict playing out in his expression. Barrington's voice softened slightly. "Sir, I understand the position you're in. but I need the truth." A long pause. Then, finally, the man sighed. His shoulders slumped, as if he had just accepted something inevitable. "It wasn't the Navy man who started it," Reynolds admitted, his voice low. "It was Jake and his guys. They've been treating this place like their own personal clubhouse for months. They harassed that woman," he gestured toward Margaret, "from the moment she walked in. And when she stood up to them, they attacked her." A ripple of tension crackled through the air. Jake's smirk faltered. "You lying son of a..." "Sit down," Barrington barked, his sharp tone cutting through the room like a knife. Jake's mouth snapped shut, his hands balling into fists, but he didn't move. Barrington turned back to Reynolds. "Thank you for your honesty." He looked around the cafe. "Anyone else?" There was another long pause. Then, "I saw it, too," a voice said hesitantly. Margaret turned toward the sound. It was the waitress, the same young woman who had been so dismissive of her earlier. She stood near the kitchen doorway, arms crossed over her chest, her lips pressed tightly together. Her eyes flickered toward Jake, then to Barrington. They were messing with her. The whole time. Calling her names, making her uncomfortable. And when she stood her ground, Jake hit her. She swallowed. And that's when her son stepped in. Another murmur rippled through the room. Jake's face darkened. "You little..." "That's enough," Barrington snapped. Silence fell again. Then, one by one, more voices joined in. "I saw it too," an older man in the back admitted. "Didn't want to say anything at first, but it's true. They've been running this place like they own it," another woman muttered. "They scare people into keeping quiet." The truth was unraveling. The facade Jake had built, the control, the intimidation, it was crumbling right in front of him. Barrington turned to the two officers who had initially detained Henry. "Unacceptable," he said, his voice laced with restrained fury. "You took the word of these men without question. You arrested a decorated Navy officer without a shred of real evidence." The older officer cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Sir, we were acting based on the statements we had at the time." "Well, now you have new statements," Barrington said. "So let's fix this." He turned to Jake and Troy. "Jake Connor. Troy Evans. You're both under arrest for assault, intimidation, and filing a false police report." Troy paled. "You can't be serious." "Do I look like I'm joking?" Barrington gestured toward the officers. "Cuff them." The lead officer hesitated for only a moment before stepping forward. Jake lurched as if he might resist, but the presence of Barrington, and the very real fact that the tide had turned against him, kept him in check. As the officers secured the cuffs around his wrists, Jake turned his glare toward Henry. "This ain't over, Navy boy," he spat. "You'll regret this." Henry didn't flinch. He didn't even react. He simply held Jake's gaze with a cold, steady stare. Barrington took a step toward Jake, his expression dark. "You just threatened a lieutenant in the United States Navy in front of multiple law enforcement officers. Do you really want to add to your charges?" Jake snapped his mouth shut. Troy, on the other hand, didn't even try to fight. He looked almost defeated. The officers led them toward the door. As they passed, Margaret caught a glimpse of something in Jake's eyes, anger, yes. But also fear. Good, she thought. Let him be afraid for once. Barrington turned back to Henry. "Lieutenant, I owe you an apology." Henry shook his head. "Not your fault, sir." Margaret stepped closer, touching her son's arm. "Thank you," she said to Barrington, her voice thick with emotion. "For believing in him. For believing in me." Barrington gave her a small nod. "I just did what should have been done from the start." Margaret exhaled shakily, the adrenaline slowly draining from her body. It was over. Finally, it was over. The cafe had changed. Its warmth was gone. Its spirit was different. But for the first time since she stepped through the door that evening, Margaret no longer felt powerless. Justice had spoken. And this time, it had spoken loud enough for everyone to hear. Margaret stepped outside the cafe, the crisp evening air wrapping around her like a long-lost embrace. The distant hum of police sirens was fading now, the flashing lights no longer bouncing off the windows of the small-town streets. The chaos had settled, justice had been served, and yet, the weight in her chest remained. Beside her, Henry stood tall, his broad shoulders squared, his presence as steady as ever. He had been trained to handle pressure, to withstand forces that would break most men. But tonight had been different. This wasn't a battlefield overseas, it was home. And sometimes, home could be just as cruel. Margaret reached up, brushing her fingers gently across his sleeve. "Are you all right?" she asked, searching his face. Henry hesitated before exhaling through his nose, his gaze drifting toward the cafe. "I should be asking you that, Mom." She offered him a small, tired smile. "I've been through worse." Henry didn't look convinced. His eyes traced the bruise forming along her cheek, the dried blood at the corner of her mouth. His fists clenched at his sides, but he said nothing. A rustling sound behind them made Margaret glance over her shoulder. The cafe owner, Mr. Reynolds, stood at the doorway, his hat in his hands, eyes downcast. "Mrs. Benson," he said quietly, stepping forward. "I owe you an apology." Margaret tilted her head. "For what?" He swallowed hard. "For not stepping in sooner. For not saying something when I should have. I let those men treat this place like they owned it, and I let good people suffer because of it." Margaret studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Fear makes people do things they're not proud of. But what matters is that you did the right thing in the end." Reynolds let out a breath of relief. "It won't happen again, ma'am. I'll make sure of it." She believed him. The events of the night had shaken him, but more than that, they had forced him to see what he had been complicit in. Change would come, slow but certain. Margaret gave him a small nod before turning back to Henry. "Come on, sweetheart. Let's go home." The drive back to her house was quiet. The town's streetlights flickered in the darkness, casting elongated shadows over the road. Margaret could hear the low hum of the tires on the asphalt, the rhythmic sound oddly soothing after the night they'd had. Henry had barely spoken since they left the cafe, his hands gripping the steering wheel a little too tightly. She knew that look, it was the same one his father used to wear after coming home from deployment. That silent war inside his mind, playing and replaying every decision, every moment. "You don't have to hold on to this, Henry," she said softly, breaking the silence. His jaw tightened. "He hit you." "I know," she said, reaching for his hand. "But you stopped him." He didn't respond right away. His grip loosened just a fraction. "Things like this," he finally murmured. "They shouldn't still be happening." Margaret sighed. "No, they shouldn't." They drove the rest of the way in silence. When they arrived at Margaret's small home, Henry turned off the engine and stepped out first, coming around to open the door for her. Some things never changed. He was still the same boy who had been raised to respect his mother, to look out for her, to be her protector. Margaret stepped inside, immediately comforted by the familiar warmth of her house. The scent of old books, faint vanilla from a candle she had left burning earlier, the creak of the wooden floors beneath her feet, it was all a reminder that this was her sanctuary. Henry followed behind, his sharp eyes scanning the space like he was still on duty, checking for any unseen threats. Margaret shook her head with amusement. "You can relax, Lieutenant," she teased gently. He let out a small breath, shaking his head. Force of habit. Margaret sat down carefully on the couch, wincing slightly as her ribs protested the movement. Henry immediately noticed. "You need to see a doctor," he said firmly. She waved a dismissive hand. "Oh, Henry, I'll be fine." He wasn't having it. "You took a bad hit, Mom. You need to get checked out." Margaret sighed, knowing there was no point in arguing with him. "Fine. Tomorrow." Henry sat down beside her, rubbing a hand over his face. He looked exhausted, his usual strong demeanor slightly cracked from the events of the night. "You don't have to stay," Margaret said gently. "I know you have things to do, places to be." Henry shook his head. "I'm not going anywhere. I'll stay for a few days." Margaret felt a warmth spread through her chest. It had been years since he had stayed more than a night. Life had pulled him in so many directions, taken him across the world, demanded so much of his time. But now, for a little while at least, she had him here. She hesitated before speaking, knowing she was treading on sensitive ground. "Sweetheart, can I ask you for something?" Henry turned to her, eyebrows slightly furrowed. "Of course." Margaret took a deep breath. "I want to see all of you together again. You, Mark, and David. Before I start any treatment for my eyesight." Henry blinked, caught off guard. He sat back, exhaling slowly. "That might not be easy." "I know," she said. "But it's important to me." Henry studied her face, his gaze softening. He knew why she was asking. He knew there were risks, that there were no guarantees when it came to surgery at her age. Margaret reached out, resting a hand over his. "It's been too long since I had all my boys in one room. And I don't know how much longer I'll have to make that happen." Henry's throat bobbed as he swallowed. Then, after a moment, he gave a small nod. "I'll make it happen." Margaret squeezed his hand, her heart swelling with gratitude. "Thank you, sweetheart." They sat there for a while, neither speaking, just existing in the quiet comfort of home. The night had been long, painful, exhausting. But they had made it through. Together. And as Margaret leaned her head against the back of the couch, feeling the presence of her son beside her, she knew one thing for certain. Family was everything. Life teaches us that strength is not just about physical power, it's about resilience, dignity, and the courage to stand up when the world tells you to sit down. Margaret Benson's story reminds us that no matter our age, our presence in this world is valuable, and we deserve respect. Facing prejudice and intimidation, she stood her ground, proving that even in the face of hostility, grace and dignity are powerful weapons. Her son, Henry, embodies another lesson: honor and integrity should never waver, even when the odds are stacked against us. He did what was right, not what was easy. In a world where injustice can be overlooked, he chose to act. And when justice seemed out of reach, perseverance and truth brought it to light. But above all, this story is about family. As we grow older, we realize that time with loved ones is our most precious gift. Margaret's wish to see her children together before her surgery is something many of us can relate to. Life is unpredictable, but love and family are constants. We should cherish every moment, mend old wounds, and ensure that, no matter what, We never take those we love for granted.